I'll start out with a few questions before we open it up to the audience. But this is your first documentary feature, but I think the former Yugoslavia and its history is an important aspect across your work. So I think maybe a good place to start would be what was it about the tourism industry in Bosnia and Herzegovina that made it your focal point for this film?
Um, what was interesting is like how there's this reflex back home, back in Bosnia, to sort of like tie every space to some sort of historical narrative, whether it be fictional or like tied to a particular ideological framework. So it's never there's never uh, an attempt to create a new narrative. They're always like revert back to like tying themselves into a particular point in history. And I just find that a fascinating thing to talk about in today's context where a lot of other countries are dealing with like a similar um, system of references when it comes to like their tourist industry. And I wanted to sort of explore that in a country that I was familiar with where I felt like the best narrative that could have kind of been promoted has already sort of passed it, and they're still tying themselves to these other frameworks that essentially just support the divisions that exist in the country.
So you structure it around these four destinations. I'm curious to hear how familiar you were with all of these or some of these places, and perhaps like what your process was to uh, winnow them down to four destinations for the film. Like how many in total did you see?
So I had about five originally, and one of the things that like was really important for me to sort of establish was like which of these sites are international hotspots for a lot of tourists that visit the country from abroad. And these four were the ones that sort of defined that because a lot of the tourists are not necessarily just from the country, they're actually coming from other parts of the world. They're seeing the country through these sites. And the people that sort of they engage with are the ones whose history they're like taking around the world, and they're like so this the perspective from one particular group, um, and that was sort of like the reason why the fifth place was sort of cut, as it didn't really tie into this internationalism that existed. It was way more local, and it wasn't really tied to. It was tied to like a myth of Mehmet Pasha Sokolovic and like the way that a lot of these the different people in the country sort of try to take credit for the this historical figure whose like narrative becomes completely dissolved by the divisions that exist in the country. So yeah, that was the one that was cut. And there was a framework of like using the Bosnian church and the Stečak idea that's going to be part of like another film that I make in the future that it was just too big to kind of fit into this one.
So I'm curious to hear more about your approach to this film, which is quite striking, and in the sense of you're showing us these destinations and contrasting them with these, for the most part, disembodied or anonymous voices who are sort of functioning as tour guides of the space and giving their history to us. How much was that approach in your mind as you were shooting and interviewing? Um, was it something that figured in to your film after you did a lot of shooting?
No, there was something that was actually it was designed in such a way so that the people can sort of speak about these spaces the way they see fit. Like I did not want to interfere in that. Um, Even the way that I framed them was designed with my DP like prior to the actual arrival. When we did the initial scouting, we sort of found the people and the spaces that we wanted to represent. Um, and at times, like when we were explaining the actual story and like what other cities we're visiting, they sort of um, realized that it was like an unusual documentary, but they sort of spoke their mind. Like some were comfortable speaking about other topics, others were really reluctant to speak anything beyond the sort of the tourist elements that we discussed in the film. So yeah, in a nutshell, it was sort of like the framework, the formal framework was set, but what they said was either sort of predetermined by them because they would rehearse it and because they would tell other tourists that arrive there, um, um, and very few sort of engaged with the questions I was posing. Specifically in Visoko and in Tuzla, the second and the third space, they were really open to talk about practically any topic, some of the people. But in Medjugorje and in Visegrad, it was so we're like had to be really careful as to like what direction the narrative would go in.
So did you have to go through any sort of vetting process with your subject for those last two places that you mentioned, as far as convincing them that you would be using this information in a way that would not, abuse their trust with you, or were they wary or suspicious of how you, as perhaps a kind of outsider filmmaker, was going to like exchange their story with a broader audience?
I mean, they knew that I was like a filmmaker that makes sort of art house films, so they knew that the audience would probably be quite limited. So I think that on some level they they maybe weren't as nervous about it, but the like it was pretty frank discussion as to like what the film was. Um, some of the stuff that happened in the edit, in terms of like sort of the ideology that kind of came out through these conversations and how they framed it, that a lot of that happened just sort of spending time with the footage in the edit, but they were never really misrepresented. Like they never said anything they didn't feel like would necessarily be used in a different context, and it wasn't. So some of the people in Tuzla have seen the film. In the other places, they haven't. I just haven't been to the country to show them the film. Um, some I'm not even sure how to get into contact with because some are sort of like diaspora. They actually do not live in that country anymore. Um, so like specifically around the Medjugorje festival, the youth festival, a lot of people come. They used to live there. They kind of have this big event and then they kind of go back to Germany or Austria or wherever. Um, so there's like it was like the entire process was tied into sort of getting them to be comfortable with a topic that they would discuss, and none of the topics that I kind of wanted to engage with that they chose not to discuss was not discussed. So there were a few times where they're like, this is off camera, and that was never used, unfortunately. We just had to turn it off.
So how long was your shooting process? How long did it take in total from all these places?
So it was like a 3 month process that lasted about 30 shooting days. So like it started in June of 2016 and it ended end of August 2016.
And how much footage did you amass?
Like 73 hours. Yeah, a lot.
I'll ask one more question, and then we can take some questions from the audience. But I think there's, among many other aspects in the film, there's certainly an irony to hear that the majority of the voices are representing a kind of older generation, and telling us about this aspect of tourism that's meant to renew the profile of any given region. Was this intentional? Or did you speak to younger generations, or yeah?
Yeah, I spoke to the younger generations, but they were much more critical and didn't buy into the narrative. Um, they were very critical of the spaces, which I found interesting, but I did not want that particular sort of take to enter how these people are presented because they would undermine what these other people are saying. So there were a few young people that ended up staying in the dock. The ones that did not necessarily counter the space itself. In Tuzla, there was a lot of dissenting voices about like all sorts of topics, and they really understood what I was doing, and they sort of were like saying what the film is about without actually me needing to actually make it. So they did not like their sort of dissent, and they don't necessarily live in that space anymore, but they're very sort of vocal about it because they constantly come back and they live abroad because they had to leave. Like a lot of youth in that country, they just left. Um, they would sort of reference it in in ways that sort of undermine its tourist potential. So that was like one of the other elements that I found really important when making it. That like whoever is dissenting still has to sort of talk about the space in relation to its present, and how that present is contested, right? So like the local history and the way that Tuzla, for example, the last place, the way that like the leftist politics sort of operates in that context. There's a lot of opinions, right? But the dominant form and the way that people sort of come and pay respect to these monuments of socialism is the one that's sort of the most dominant right now, especially with the people that are there.
Did it ever figure into your mind that you maybe perhaps wanted to interview the international tourists that were coming in and out? Was that ever a part of your plan?
No, but there were a few people we did sort of that did like share their opinion, but it was just sort of like an exploratory thing we did during the scouting. It just never made it into like the actual formal process once it was set.
We can take some questions. Yes, sir, standing. There's a mic that'll come to you in a second.
I understand the sort of absence of the Muslim population or the Muslim sites because they're probably out of the purview of your idea of international tourism or whatever. But I'm a little curious anyway as to why that didn't get in there somehow.
Well, the most prominent internationalism that sort of happens within that space is like the Visoko. But what's interesting about Visoko is that sort of the some elements of Bosniak nationalism, they attempted to tie it to like the idea of being sort of first in the country, but this was later on tied into like the SDP, the Socialist Party, trying to kind of, as the man indicates, trying to tie that framework as like Bosnian Herzegovinians being the first to like be in this space. So I just found it fascinating how the Bosniak population doesn't necessarily have an internationalism to to a particular site. It's usually these other identities that are trying to create these narratives, like whether it be from Serbia or Croatia, and tying their history to like the Bosnian idea. Yeah.
There was a hand back there.
I'm sorry. I have a couple of questions, if I can. Did you receive any or apply for any funding from the Bosnian government for the film? And if you did, what type of pushback and what type of reaction on the part of an official sponsor to the actual film that you made? Which obviously I thought was very good, but I could see how the Bosnian government would not see it as a promotional type film. Other question I have, obviously you didn't do Mostar and Sarajevo, rather the big, I thought big tourist draws in terms of the Ottoman presence. Why did you do that? Was just because they're so well known, or some other reason?
So in answer to the first question, I did not apply to any funds in the country in relation to this project. In part because they don't have much money for documentary film, period. And the other part is that I was trying to apply with another project that I had little luck getting funding for, so I just didn't want to try with this one as well. The second part is that the sites you described, Mostar, Sarajevo, these are sites that are featured in a lot of films. These are sites that we're familiar with more. So as this is like a sort of a special interest documentary in a way, like what I was interested in is how these lesser known sites that already have an international draw are sort of contextualized within that spirit of like an ideological framework that's being pushed by a particular group. I don't feel that there is one sort of clearly defined approach that the Bosniak ethnic group has about the way that they tie themselves to a particular site. I actually think it's the most sort of pluralistic, because there's secularists within that tradition. There's people that are sort of more tied into like the Ottoman idea. I don't feel like they are as they're not foreign in a way to like the idea is not as foreign to the approach that some of these other sites are approaching these ideologies that are not necessarily tied to that particular place, but they're also coming from external sources.
Yes, right here.
I have two questions.
Oh, we'll have a mic. Do 1 second.
Thanks. I have two questions. One, there was a very favorable opinion stated of Tito as being a great unifier, and I'm just wondering if that opinion of him is prevalent across the region. And then my second question is, if you could just describe your own background as far as, I mean, you were probably a little baby during the war, but your own, ethnic background, your family, particularly as pertains to the war.
I mean, some people believe that Tito was like the great unifier. Not everybody. Bosnia is more sort of nostalgic around that period for sure, as like sort of many different factors indicate like life was easier during that period. There was an idea of plurality that was celebrated. I mean, that state had a lot of flaws, but there were flaws that could have been sort of dealt with by the introduction of multi-party representation and different forms of sort of democratic processes. But I felt there was definitely a draw that the younger generation had for this history, sort of understanding it, putting it within like a particular framework. But there wasn't really a space in all those cities to do that. In Sarajevo, which is like much more pluralistic, you have an engagement with this period. You do not have an engagement with this period in like a place like Visegrad. You do not have an engagement with this period in a place like Medjugorje, apart from the sort of the 60s period with when a lot of the people that were sort of thought of as being neo-fascist stayed in the region, and they were abused by Rankovic and the regime at the time. They don't really think about like the things that were committed in the name of this regime just automatically makes it a non-starter to have a conversation about this period in certain regions of Bosnia. So the big hubs, like the bigger cities, there is definitely a nostalgia for this period though. So, but not in the small places, small cities. My background, like I was born in Sarajevo. My parents are mixed, so I consider myself a Bosnian Herzegovinian. Like I do not identify with any of the ethnic groups, but my mom's Bosniak and my dad's Serbian. So I don't know if that helps. I think it's not really entirely relevant. I think one of the reasons why there's a problem in the narratives of that country is that we try to categorize people in these like really sort of insular sort of frameworks, just like where do you come from? How valid is your narrative? But yeah, that is my story, I guess. Yeah. Thanks for the question, though.
I'm sorry, is there time for two?
Yeah.
You were very enthusiastic.
I don't know whether this is helpful, but it seems to me the equivalent of a Diane Arbus picture. The film seems like a Diane Arbus pastiche of creepy people doing creepy things. I don't know.
Oh, that's a great introduction to my question.
Oh, good. Okay. That's what I live for. And I'm puzzled as to how you got financing for this. It's not my business, of course, but I am interested in how you got financing for it because it is an unusual way of filming. It's an unusual take, and the whole approach seemed to me quite disparate from all documentaries I've heard of.
May I add my question to yours? Yeah, because these are dovetailing questions. I thought the film was rather grotesque in a way, and it seems to be anti-tourist because you're doing rabble-rousing tourism and not
the core issues that draw people to the Bosnian pyramids, for instance. Your first shot of the region was a man who was playing a flute in his gift shop with those stone spheres. The largest known stone sphere in the universe is in that site, and no one has explained how it got there, who sculpted it, where it came from. The Egyptian government for the last 75 years has prohibited scientific study of the pyramids. And in the Bosnian pyramids, we have physical scientists doing studies that dovetail with the findings of Nikola Tesla, which are very interesting, planar waves coming out of the top of that pyramid of the sun. So there are actual scientific interests and cultural interests that go beyond tourism that you depicted, which I felt was a missing element in the film.
Yes, we go back and forth. And I recently read a very important piece, a study on Harbin in China, where they want to bring tourism in because they think that's the way to success and making money. And the focus was there incorrect, although there's a lot to see in Harbin and so forth if you want to tolerate the cold. But the focus here about tourism seemed, again, mythical, and it isn't going to happen. Virgin Mary concept and the whole things that we saw rising up in the morning and going, it seems sort of louche, sort of déclassé, not really passionate as one usually expects from a hub of tourism. And maybe this is not relevant also, but it just seemed that they're dreaming if they think that they're going to establish a touristic mecca based on X, Y, and Z.
I'm not sure if that's a question, but I can comment on so Medjugorje is one of the most visited Catholic pilgrimage sites in the world. It attracts 1 million people. So that space alone attracts almost as many people as the rest of Bosnia. So I mean, some of these places do not need like support. Like they're gonna have a lot of people coming to these sites anyway. It was just like a way of studying how ideology ties itself into a particular tourist hotspot. And in answer to the Visoko pyramids, like I was like the scientific community is at least like the international scientific community is not really interested in the site anymore. They were initially when they originally published the discovery. They did discover a lot of ancient artifacts and a lot of ancient construction not tied to like these prehistoric people, but tied to like a different like the Bosnian medieval period and like structures related to that and the Roman period. So right now there isn't any support for like further excavation from the Bosnian government and from the local municipal authorities because there is no international sort of support for it. There's some groups who are not directly supported by the international scientific community who are trying to still create awareness about this particular project, but a way that they've rebranded the experience is to sort of attract like new age enthusiasts and like other groups to explore the site. But the sphere that you talk about is not actually at that site. The sphere you talk about is actually about 100+ kilometers away. So I was not looking at that sphere at all.
It's part of the ecosystem because the tourists were buying those spheres as well.
Right, like that sphere was something that was discovered, I think, about 6 or 7 years after these pyramids were discovered, but not in that part of Bosnia. Yeah.
Is that connected to the bathroom sign? You had a man sign and a woman sign, and then you had an alien sign.
I mean, that's how they're advertising the space, right? Like they're the ones that are adding these new sort of new age approaches to attract tourists. That was there.
That was Nikola Tesla, by the way. You'll find out that was Nikola Tesla's connection to where the pyramids came from, and where there are pyramids all over the world. Yeah. They came from people who were not part of our current line of civilization, and our historic perspective is why the Egyptian government is embarrassed by some research that points in that direction.
I mean, I don't know about that, but nobody discussed that. Samir didn't talk about that either.
A study about Nikola Tesla's research, which was cut off by our government some years ago, as you know, when he died.
Right.
All of his files went into secret FBI security research papers that were never published. Yeah.
But like in answer to your, that's an interesting conversation. In answer to your other question, like it was funded by our councils in Canada. That's why. That's the only reason it was made. That was the only way to make it, actually.
There was a question right back there.
Hi. So Kusturica has created this town, and you mentioned the town, and you sort of mentioned a little bit of language, although he lives in Paris. But what is Kusturica doing there? And I know he invites people, but is it starting to become some sort of cultural hub? And that's the first question. And another thing, they're working on, they need electricity, so they're thinking about damming up a lot of those streams. And that area, like I've been studying this for a while, is a gold mine when it comes to, like, it's the only place in all of the entire European Union that still has clean water, and like fishing and motorcycle camping and all that stuff. So I think that area, cause it reminds me a lot of, you didn't mention the gypsy community, but it sort of reminds me of Andalusia in the 50s and the 60s, and I think it's going to become, like, I think people are going to start moving to it and retiring in the middle of nowhere and creating communities. I don't know, what do you think about that? Thanks.
So I'll answer the last one first. I mean, there's like ethno villages everywhere in that region, so like that is already happening. As being like the cleanest source of fresh water, like there are definitely places in Bosnia that are that. Not every place, and the Drina Valley is not that clean. From my own experience there, but the first question related to Kusturica. So, I mean, he said it like they said it themselves. Like it's a testament to a renaissance they never had. So if you want to interpret that as an actual renaissance or as an affront to like the people that were there for 500 years and somehow they just want to kind of wash it away. I mean, there isn't really more that you can say. So if you are promoting a space, calling it Andrićgrad, but you're actually promoting a space that, imagines a renaissance that never arrived at this place. And what happened 500 years ago, it was under Ottoman rule. So this idea that like everything would have been better without the Ottoman rule. So it is what it is. It's an affront to the peace in that country. There isn't like we shouldn't go beat around it. Like people try to excuse it. Europeans try to excuse it. Johnny Depp tries to excuse it. A lot of people that are probably sat here try to excuse it, but it is what it is.
We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Igor, for this film. I didn't fall asleep. My eyes were wide open the whole time. Also, being from Bosnia, it was interesting for me just to look at some of these places. I've visited most of them. But I have a few questions. I'm wondering, in Visegrad, when you were there with the Andrićgrad, at the time when you were shooting, I think it's 2016 possibly, right? How much talk was there about the actual finances of this project? Because some public money was used in this, and there was a lot of talk. Kusturica was involved in this. It was a big scandal. Then it sort of just disappeared. But I was wondering, on the local level, what was really happening there when you were there in your conversations? Obviously, the characters that are in the film, the subjects, they're kind of positive. They speak about him highly, calling him Professor Emir Kusturica, which I've never heard. So I was wondering how much was there? Was there sort of a dissent there, so to say? Were the people a little bit upset about this situation, which I really consider a terrible revisionist project? And he's been siding with these reactionary politicians lately. He's on a mural with one of them. And I was just wondering if you could speak about that a little bit. And my second question is just kind of something very small that kind of, I was wondering why In the subtitles, at one point, in two spots at the beginning, when Minka is speaking about the Dita factory, and she says when they decided to destroy socialism and the labor movements and the strength of the unions at the beginning here, the translation said that when the West decided, even though she doesn't say that in Bosnian. I was wondering why that, or was there something out of context there that we didn't hear? And later also in Visoko, there's a man who speaks about the past, about the Communist Party, about Tito and socialism, and also the translation implied during the time of the regime. He never says regime. I wonder whether a particular, why these choices? Or was it just an accident, somebody else translated, and you didn't have time to look at it? Because I know subtitling is a lot of work.
It was like, I'll answer the last one first. So like it was a much longer conversation that like dragged on, and just to sort of help with contextualize, like bring it back to that point, like we used a way to sort of just help people stay focused on the particulars related to what he was talking about in that particular time. So Minka talked about a lot about like the West and like these programs, Markovic, and like this entire period. We didn't have. If this was like maybe a mini series, it's like something that could have been featured more. This sort of Markovic period and like how that was the IMF programs and like the Western programs, the austerity measures, right? So that's how that came into just sort of like using this idea of the West as a way to kind of quickly privatize the existing systems. The thing about Visegrad, in Visegrad, people are sort of, when it comes to, I'll start with like the war itself. They do not want to talk about it. When it comes to Kusturica, they also are sort of, a few people sort of will say things that are critical, but because the city has tied itself to this project, they're not that critical. They'll tell you things in private, but they'll not be comfortable saying it in front of the camera. So it was sort of like an interesting sort of way of trying to get them to speak about how this project came about. And they talk about like the one man, the old tourist guide that's standing at the bridge. He talks about how there was this beautiful park, and this park was now transformed. It used to be kids playing soccer there and whatnot. Now it's been transformed into this particular space, but he only concludes by saying, "But this space is great, and people now visit it for other reasons." So everybody still, even though they're critical, like they start a critique of it, they quickly correct themselves. It's like self-censorship. It's almost like a police state where like people are just self-censoring. They're like about to give you a glimpse or a window into like a critique, but they're like, "Oh shit, I shouldn't have said that." So like they quickly correct it. And that happened throughout all the interviews in Visegrad, which was like really kind of interesting.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but Igor, thank you so much for being here and for your film, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you for coming.